Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's not good, that sound. I'm sorry. Welcome to the Marmara Urban Forum, organized by Marmara Municipalities Union. Our session is on Road to Urban Resilience, Local Plans and Practices. I'm the moderator of the session. My name is Sinan, Özden. I'm the timekeeper, and we're already 6 minutes late. I'd like to invite all the panelists to the podium without further ado. I'm going to present them in order of delivery of their talks. Mr. Arthur Hinsch from ICLEI Europe. He is the Built Infrastructure and Sustainable Energies Officer. Miss Julie Greenwalt, Lead on Cities and Nature-Based Solutions from Global Center on Adaptation. Mr. Ervin Sezgin, Marmara Region Local Governments Consultant from RESLOG Turkey project. Mr. Mehmet Murat Çalık, the Mayor of Beylikdüzü Municipality. And Hilmar Tevrüz Lojewski, Councillor of the German Association of Cities. Welcome. Our session is on Road to Urban Resilience, Local Plans and Practices. Resilience will be the core topic of all presentations. It is hard to describe what it exactly means, actually. We have a hard time finding the right word in Turkish. We have different words like resilience, resistance, strength. In the group that I work with, we prefer to use the word resilience as resilience in Turkish. We just adopted it in English form, because we have a hard time describing it in Turkish. In order to define and discuss a concept, you should not determine a specific word, actually. The word sustainability is another example. It took us a long time to decide what it exactly means in Turkey and how we should translate it into Turkish. The word workshop in Turkish, again, was a hard one to translate into. Therefore, the word resilience is another difficult example to translate into Turkish. We have different words that we came up with in Turkish, like strength, resistance, etc. Maybe before we find the right terminology for that, we can keep on using the English term in Turkish. We will now continue with Mr. Arthur Hinsch. Mr. Hinsch from ICLEI. Are you going to present from the podium? Yes. Let's start the session then. Each presenter has 15 minutes, 1-5, and you are now aware of the app. You can ask your questions by using the app. And I will see your questions in my screen. I'm sure you are aware of this procedure from the other sessions as well. We will dedicate 15 minutes at the end of the session for the Q&A, and our panelists will address your questions. The floor is yours, Mr. Hinsch.
Late morning, everybody. My name is Arthur Hinsch. I have the pleasure to represent the European Secretariat of ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to host us here and for me to have this opportunity to present. I look very much forward to trying to compress the things that ICLEI does in 15 minutes. I think it's quite a challenge. You'll notice I speak in English. I always understand from yesterday that the interpreters are doing a very good job. So looking forward to this. Before we start actually talking about my particular presentation, so ICLEI, Local Governance for Sustainability, is an international network of local governments, local and regional governments actually, for sustainable urban development. We have roughly a membership-based organization, as I mentioned. We have roughly 1,750 local and regional governments on board, and we have 22 offices worldwide, and we are active in more than 100 countries. I say we have 22 offices worldwide. Myself, I represent the European Secretariat, and we're based in Freiburg, Germany. I think we also should have a colleague of mine from the World Secretariat walking around here somewhere as well. So today in my presentation I will give you a brief introduction actually on what ICLEI is doing in the field of sort of climate and climate neutrality and urban resilience, specifically from the point of view of the European Secretariat. To give you just a little bit more insight here, so like I said, ICLEI is a member network. The reason why municipalities, local governments join ICLEI is because they have the opportunity to liaise, to contribute or to exchange with like-minded local governments all around the world, to co-create, to join forces together in projects on sustainable urban development, and to have access to very specific sort of guidance on how to implement plans and how to actually implement sustainable urban development. We are a knowledge broker organization in a sense. We bring together stakeholders from the entire spectrum of urban sustainability, local authorities, citizens, academia. We do this in projects and other activities. We do offer a lot of consultancy and training, as well as offer sort of platforms for local governments to make use of. To give a few examples here, we have platforms on sort of climate and measuring sort of the CO2 emissions of local governments to support local governments in the transition to sort of cities with a lot of nature-based solutions. We also work on the topic of sustainable procurement. We offer platforms for this, and also when it comes to reporting on Covenant of Mayors plans. We are also part of the European Secretariat, as part of the Secretariat for the European Covenant of Mayors. We are involved, specifically the European Secretariat is involved in a lot of European projects on sustainable urban development, on climate neutrality and resilience. This is just an example, and this goes very fast, of projects we're involved in, it's covering the entire spectrum, actually, of the energy transition, of nature-based solutions, of sustainable procurement. Mobility is a very key topic and very important to us, and very strongly involved there with a myriad of different partners. We offer platforms, and platforms offer regular conferences, actually, where we bring people together, local governments together. Some of these dates are still not very up to date. Some are. And on the same topics, to have similar conferences like the one today. So to briefly explain sort of our general understanding of how ICLEI does work and how we think within ICLEI. So we have sort of structured our way of working into 5 pathways: low emission development, nature-based development, equitable and people-centered development, resilient development, and circular development. So we believe that these things are sort of essential for achieving sustainable urban development, sustainable cities. And we also believe that the work, that in all the projects that we're doing, we're asking ourselves, okay, how do the projects and the activities that we're engaged with, how do the activities that local governments are engaged with, how do they relate to these 5 pathways? And then we see, how do they interact? And we think that equitable and people-centered development is very strongly connected to low-emission development. You can't have proper discussions about nature-based development or resilient development without talking about, again, equitable people-centered development, low-emissions development, and even the topic of waste and stopping sort of this general procedure of consuming, discarding. So all these things are very, very strongly interconnected. These are sort of the key things we focused on sort of the fields of municipal work, actually. My own specialization is within the built infrastructure and constructions and sustainable energy aspect. That's why I'm going to be focusing a little bit on that, talk a little bit about what is resilience in the sense, but also looking at resilience from an energy perspective, which is very, very interesting and very important. Very briefly, so sort of core to the work we do at ICLEI is this understanding that any kind of management or any kind of sort of planning in local governments for sustainable urban development can only happen or should happen in an integrative manner. Like I said, it should integrate different aspects of municipal sort of competence and to make sure that any sort of planning, when it comes to resilience planning, planning within the Covenant of Mayors, on climate mitigation, that it's always integrated, all stakeholders are involved. For this, we have actually developed a Clean Climate Cities planning cycle, which is something that is happening, you see often in different projects that we're engaged with, where it's 3 steps. You start with analyzing what is the status quo, you look at what can you do to actually implement it then, and once you have implemented the plan, how can you accelerate, and how can you move forward. There is guidelines produced by this, the Green Climate Cities guidelines actually that are freely available, that give you a very clear understanding of what the procedures are, what the steps are that you could follow to develop a resilience plan or a low emissions development plan within your city. And also specifically how we can support you with that. Now I'm going to briefly cover a few examples and projects that we're involved in and sort of explain the tools that have been developed to sort of support cities to act in a resilient and manner to engage in concrete planning. One project is called Smart Mature Resilience, where one of the outcomes is actually resilience management guideline, where now actually online the tools are available for cities to make use of them, but also to analyze specifically, okay, what are sort of the hazards, what are the complications in my local government that need to be addressed, and also how does it relate to, how do you then create such a plan? So these tools are available, and they have been created together with universities, other research organizations, and also co-created with local governments who are often part of our projects. The same for tools from the resident project. It's exactly the same, but not exactly the same, but definitely here the emphasis is on sort of moving away from an understanding that sort of solutions to urban resilience are sort of very city-specific, but it's moving sort of towards standardization of approaches towards tackling urban resilience. And here also very sort of useful guides on how to do this are available. From a nature-based solutions perspective, we're involved in several projects. And of course, sort of carrying forward sort of any form of nature-based solution, any form of sort of green development in cities is very, very important to us. And we have several projects in this field. One project is called ProGirec, where we work together with cities actually to sort of co-create in what we call urban living labs, sort of solutions to the green solutions, green infrastructure solutions. And we do this sort of by promoting the interaction between the local government, between NGOs, between citizens. And then once sort of a measure has been implemented, we try to transfer and replicate that successful measure to another context, to another local government in another country. I think I will go very briefly over this. So this is one example of sort of from a landfill site that has been sort of greened up actually, and there's a lot of co-creation, a lot of stakeholders are actually involved in making things like this possible. And the general sort of methodologies that apply to this and are relevant to this apply in different contexts, actually. So you can always transfer, you can try to transfer measures, but what you definitely always can transfer is the sort of the co-creation methodology and just the way how people went about it, what made it successful in the first place. Another project is called Clever City, where also the exchange between cities is very, very important, where sort of in one example, sort of the green corridors are being created in some of the cities that are involved. This is an example from the city of Hamburg, where a green corridor is being developed here and also this is connected to sort of a housing, a housing project, housing plan. And the key here is to get all the residents involved to sort of actively participate in this. And we've seen that this is very, very successful because, again, emphasizing sort of the active involvement of all stakeholders at several phases in development is very, very important. I think I don't have the time to go to every project in detail. Like I said, it's a challenge to go through all the projects in 15 minutes. However, with regard to the Connect to Nature project, what I very much would like to stress is also on an international level, not on a European. We have created something called the Urban by Nature program, which sort of facilitates cooperation with local governments in countries like Brazil, Korea, and China, to actually support them using sort of this green climate cities integrated management circle to replicate or also follow a similar lines of development. So all of the information is available online, and Now, as I mentioned, from the energy perspective, myself, I'm an officer for sustainable energies and built infrastructure. So when you talk about resilience, of course, you always talk about adaptation to climate change, increase in temperatures, and general sort of mitigation of risks. But this mitigation of risks also very much applies to the energy aspect, the energy part. And here I'm going to showcase very briefly two projects that we're currently involved in. One is called PROSEU, Prosumers for the Energy Union. And here, actually, we talk, or we try to mainstream the prosumer model. So self-generating and self-consuming renewable energy. We're trying to mainstream that within the European Energy Union. And we ask the question, okay, what are the incentive structures for citizens, but also for local governments to support this process, to engage in this process? There is this issue of social acceptance. Of course, you could talk about creating a decentralized, a resilient energy system, but it's of no use to you if this energy system is not acceptable to people. To give you a good example from Germany, I'm German, is that in Germany, for instance, the installation of wind energy has, despite relatively high ambitions, is basically come to a halt, and sort of the lack of social acceptance is a very, very huge issue in this, actually. So in this win-win project, we bring together stakeholders from local governments, from energy agencies, planning authorities, citizens, and also from stakeholders from community energy projects, like community-owned wind parks, so renewable energy installations where both the local government but also the citizens themselves have a financial stake in and can actually participate sort of in the planning process. And we ask the question, okay, how does that relate to social acceptance? And we see that by actually encouraging sort of this participation of citizens and having this dialogue going on between developers of renewable energy installations, local governments, and citizens, social acceptance can be very much increased. And then we try to transfer successful measures from one country to the other. Because, like I said at the beginning, also related to nature-based solutions, the general methodology about what is important to get resilience off the ground is very often very similar, and it's very much about engaging the right people at the right moment. And this is about to cover it. Last minute, thank you very much. Last minute, yeah, 1 second. And also, with regard to resilient, what does it mean to be resilient? Here, from a sort of heating perspective, we have currently a project where sort of a tool is being developed, sort of for analyzing the potential of district heating, so creating sort of a heating system that is decentralized. This is it's online available, and stakeholders from local governments, from energy agencies can go on this tool and see very specifically, okay, what is the context in my vicinity, and how can I effectively make use of district heating in my area. Wrapping up very quickly, so as I mentioned at the beginning, we have very much, at the European side, had very much a European focus, but also connecting very strongly with our other ICLEI Europe offices, and in this case with UN Habitat, actually, we sort of facilitate the exchange, the peer-to-peer exchange and sort of exchange of knowledge on an international level, on a global level. And this is done by the Urban Let's project, where we bring together actually stakeholders, not from Europe, and connect stakeholders from Europe to stakeholders in other parts of the world, and we co-create and with them sort of a integrated climate, climate resilience and climate plan. So very last slide. So like I said, coming back, we have this interconnection of different topics. I talked about energy here, I talked about nature-based solutions. And in the end, what is important to take into account, to consider, is that everything we do, everything that you do, is always, topics are always interconnected. And with every sort of planning that you do, and with regard to resilience or to climate change, urban development in general, the interconnection of different topics is key to making sure that the planning you're doing is actually sustainable in the long run. And as ICLEI, we look very much forward to supporting you in that. Thank you.
Bay Hinsch, çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Süreyi de büyük...
Thank you very much. Well, you very efficiently used time, so thank you, Arthur Hinsch. We heard there are 5 levels of analysis, and partners are very important in decision taking, and sustainable systems are a part of a holistic planning methodology. Now we're going to hear Mrs. Julie Greenwalt. She's going to talk and lead on cities, and you can talk there if you would like to talk there. And we wonder what you have to say. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Despite some confusion when I was checking in, there was an attempt to put me to the Beauty Istanbul line, but I'm very glad to be in this one. I think this is slightly more important to me, and hopefully will have a more lasting impact. No negativity towards people focused on beauty, but I think Ervin is more important and dearer to my heart, certainly. So I work for the Global Center on Adaptation. The Global Center is a relatively new organization that's really focused on solutions and knowledge for climate change adaptation specifically. And the center, we work globally. We're headquartered in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. We work with a broad range of stakeholders, both city governments, national governments, as well as private sector and civil society. And we are currently in the process of expanding. We now have an office in China and Beijing. We're opening offices in Bangladesh and Dhaka, in Miami and Mexico. And so, although we're new, we're expanding rapidly, and I think it's greatly or closely linked to the fact that there's a lot of interest on climate change adaptation and a lot of recognition of the need to accelerate action on that. One of our key areas of work is we co-host and co-manage the Global Commission on Adaptation with the World Resources Institute. The Global Commission on Adaptation has 34 commissioners. It's chaired by Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the UN, Bill Gates, and Kristalina Georgieva, formerly of the World Bank and currently with the IMF, and about 30 other commissioners from national governments like Germany, the Netherlands, Bangladesh, as well as private sector representatives, civil society from Oxfam and the IFRC. And the purpose of the commission is really to accelerate adaptation action through increased political leadership and basically it's premised on the idea that adaptation unfortunately hasn't received as much attention or funding as mitigation has in the climate change world. This is not to say that climate change mitigation has happened at a scale that is required, but it is to say that adaptation unfortunately hasn't received as much of the attention and will and action as is necessary. And so the Commission is really focused on trying to accelerate this at all levels, at the global level down to the local level. And we do this through 2 main areas. One is through a flagship report that was just released on September 10th that I'll share some of the findings with. and through a year of action, which we just launched on the 24th of September, that is focused around 8 different action tracks, one of which is on cities. And this will carry through to October of 2020, when there will be an adaptation summit that will be held in the Netherlands. But the aims of the Commission and the aims of the Center go beyond this year of action, and many of the goals are geared towards 2025 or 2030, as we see these as critical time frames for adaptation action. So just to give some of the findings from the report. So the report, which is called Adapt Now, a global call for leadership on climate resilience. So the report is premised around 3 imperatives for action on adaptation. The first is the moral or the human imperative, and this is really related to the fact that the impacts of climate change will be felt more severely by those who are least contributed to climate change, right? So this is related to the poor, both in urban and rural areas around the world. The youth and women and girls will feel the impacts of climate change at a much higher rate than wealthier sections of the population. And so this is about focusing adaptation actions on the most vulnerable. The second is on the environmental imperative. And so this is about the fact that we already know that 1 in 4 species are facing extinction, and this is expected to accelerate from climate change. We also know that about 1/4 of all ice-free land is facing degradation, and this will also be accelerated, as well as impacts on marine life and oceans. So the imperative here is around the fact that climate change will accelerate these issues of degradation that we're already seeing in the natural environment. And the third is around the economic imperative. And so this focuses on the fact that it actually makes strong economic sense to invest now in resilience. And the report found that investing $1.8 trillion US dollars in 5 areas of adaptation from 2020 to 2030 would generate $7.1 trillion in return on that investment. So that's a very high rate of return, 1.7 to 7.1 trillion. It focused on 5 indicative areas, which were early warning systems, climate resilient infrastructure, crop production and dryland agriculture, mangrove protection, and more resilient water resources. These are indicative areas. They're not necessarily the only areas of adaptation and resilience to invest in, but these were the ones where the economic argument was the strongest. So how do we get to addressing this based on these 3 imperatives? So the report calls for action on 3 areas, 3 revolutions. One in understanding, a revolution in planning, and a revolution in finance. So what does that mean? And what does that mean for cities? So in terms of understanding, the revolution calls for increased data, especially on risks, climate risks, and scenarios, specifically at the local level. A lot of the understanding and knowledge that we have about climate change risk is produced at a global or sometimes regional level, and there's much more of a need to have data that's relevant at the local level in order to be able to make informed decisions. There's also a need for increased understanding about the vulnerability issue and what this looks like at a local level as well. So what groups are foreseen to be the most impacted? What are the relationships to livelihoods, to whether it's people who work in the informal sector or people who are based in farming or fisheries. Also in terms of the types of residents in a city. So for example, refugees or migrants, will they have more intense impacts from climate change? Or where people live, and so data around this. And finally, about what are the possible solutions. So for example, nature-based solutions are something that we're seeing an increased uptake of, but we need more understanding about what are the most appropriate solutions in local context. In terms of the planning revolution, and this is something I think this session and many of the sessions focused here throughout this forum have more attention to. And this is really about mainstreaming this information into planning and service delivery. Sometimes this is an area that can be neglected in resilience plans, but the need to have continuous service delivery in the face of climate change, both in the face of extreme events, but also related to sort of the everyday shocks and stresses that we can anticipate will be happening in urban areas. And finally, on the finance front, we know that less than 5% of global adaptation finance has been spent on cities. So there's a very limited amount of adaptation finance that's being utilized in the urban areas. We do know that there are some shining examples where we've seen a lot of really effective adaptation action despite some of these challenges. And I think what's really encouraging is there are some kind of examples that we've known of for many years, like in Copenhagen and Durban and New York City, but we're starting to see other cities that are maybe lesser known, smaller, medium-sized cities like Orlando, Florida, like Surat in India, that are really coming on board and making strong changes to the way they're planning, having action plans around what are flood-prone areas and relocating businesses and residences as need be. So those are the main findings of the report. And now, as I said, we're moving into the year of action. As part of the year of action, there are 8 action tracks. So there's one on agriculture and food security. There's one focused on finance, infrastructure, water, nature-based solutions, locally led action, and preventing extreme events from becoming disasters, and finally on cities. Of course, there are a lot of interlinkages between these areas. For example, with the infrastructure action track, a lot of the needs for resilient infrastructure and both making existing infrastructure more resilient as well as new infrastructure, making sure it's up to the standards needed for adaptation. Of course, a lot of this happens in cities. A lot of cities have issues with water and drought, and so the need for more resilient adaptation on waterfront, of course, is very relevant for cities. And nature-based solutions, and this was one of the other findings of the report, was that there is a really strong potential for more nature-based solutions, both green infrastructure as well as hybrid green-gray infrastructure potential in cities. So the cities action track specifically is focused on 4 areas that are related to some of the findings of the report. So the first area is around capacity and increasing data and knowledge for cities, both through exchanges, as ICLEI has talked about, and there are many programs that the Commission and the Action Track are building from in terms of city networks and organizations that are very active in this space. The second is on finance, so again, trying to work both with private sector funding but also with public finance to accelerate the flows of finance into local level and municipalities. The third is on nature-based solutions, as mentioned, and so this is about more nature-based solutions for greening, for both water, for heat, to address different climate risks in cities. And finally, the last area is about this focus on vulnerable people in cities and really ensuring that planning and action for adaptation in cities is focused on the most vulnerable and addresses their needs, and that city action plans and action at the local level is oriented towards these areas with greatest need. So as I mentioned, the action track just kicked off last week, in fact, so this is very timely, and we'll be developing it throughout this year with key partners and key countries. There are 20 convening countries of the Global Commission on Adaptation that are very active in developing the action tracks, as well as the commissioners and their teams, as well as research and partners. And the year of action will be culminating, as I mentioned, in October with the Adaptation Summit in the Netherlands. But the actions are intended to go on beyond that. So for example, the overarching goal of the city's action track is about having all cities with resilient plans and policies in place by 2030. So the year of action will really be about laying this groundwork and setting up the building blocks and the foundation in order for this work to continue through to this aim of 2030. So this is to welcome you all to join the work of the Global Commission on Adaptation. I encourage you to take a look at the report, which is on gca.org. There's also a background paper well, there are several background papers, but there's one on cities, for example, as well as on issues like health, infrastructure, finance, that have informed this report. And we're looking forward to working here in this region, as well as others, and connecting the issues and the lessons learned, showcasing examples that we learn about here in other areas, and hopefully bringing to this region the examples that we know of from other areas. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Bayan Greenwalt, çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Siz de
Thank you very much, Mrs. Greenwalt. You focused on adaptation, climate change adaptation, and the resilient planning, and you assessed the adaptation, how the cities will adapt, understanding, planning, and financing. Very important to highlight. Indeed, understanding, being aware of the situation is very much important, because planning comes accordingly. And in order to apply that, we need the finance, right? So, since we mentioned about the resilience planning, we talk about planning things for resilience. We will have another stress factor, immigration. So resilience is important in terms of immigration too. So Mr. Ervin Sezgin will have the floor on migration.
Marmara Bölgesi Yerel Yönetimler
He is the Marmara region local government consultant for RESLOG Turkey. The floor is yours. I'm more comfortable standing up, but there's a cliff right behind me, so if I fall, just save me. My name is Ervin Sezgin. I'm from RESLOG, Resilience for Local Governments. I'm the local government consultant for Marmara region. I'm a city planner. I'm going to talk about resilience from a different perspective, from the perspective of migration, and especially migration of Syrian refugees. Let me first introduce our project and what we do. Rather than giving individual examples, I will focus on our approach to resilience and how we tackle this issue within the perspective of migration. And I'm going to talk about the methods we have developed. In fact, it's an analysis method which can be used when planning for development. I will also try to give some practical example as well. So, who are we? Resilience in local governance. This project is financed by the Swedish government, Swedish Local Governments and Regions Association is the implementation agency. We work with 3 municipal unions in Turkey. The first one is the National Municipalities Union, And at the local level, we work with Marmara Municipalities Union, our host, and we also work with Çukurova Municipalities Union in the south of Turkey. We also cooperate with 12 municipalities at local level. As you can see, it's a very crowded and busy project. The project is unique because it is organized with unions of municipalities, but it has an international pillar as well. So on one hand, it's an international, on the other hand, it's a local project. Again, as I told you earlier, we work with 12 different municipalities, which gives us a great opportunity to see our practices at local level. Hatay, Seyhan, Sarıçam, Reyhanlı, and Mezitli municipalities in the south. And in the north, we work with Bursa, Osman Gazi, Orhan Gazi, Şişli, Sultanbeyli, and Zeytinburnu municipalities in Bursa and Istanbul, respectively. The focal point of my presentation is the particular work we do with municipalities. I'm going to address this issue at length, but before that, let me cover what we do in general. This project has different phases, different scales. One pillar of the project is in Turkey and the other one is in Lebanon. So we have RESLOG Turkey and RESLOG Lebanon, although we do not exactly do the same things. At the Turkish component, we work on the active participation of local governments in migration policies. To this end, we have projects to strengthen the links between the local level and the national level. Also, starting with the municipalities that we work with, and also aiming at all the other municipalities in Turkey, we have a series of knowledge and data generation activities on migration and Syrian refugees. I can summarize it as bringing together the literature in Turkey and to have a database of the refugee issue, which will serve as a pool of data for local municipalities. And thirdly, we are working on migration master planning. In fact, we have a master plan for migration. It is almost ready now. It needs some further proofreading and some finishing touches. It's almost ready for printing. This has taken almost 1 year, and it includes all kinds of stages of planning. It started with an analysis, interviews with stakeholders, and development of the master plan. The reason why I was invited to address this audience in this session is to explain how this planning approach can be related with resilience. So we will take this concept and implement it within the sphere of refugees and migration. As the previous speakers mentioned, the concept of resilience is mainly used when talking about climate change. Regardless of the topic, it may be migration, it may be climate change, and we know that refugee migration is also related with climate change. But we approach the topic from a different perspective. Resilience is a very functional concept for us. What does it mean? When a system is faced with an immediate shock, is it able to come back to its previous form? Is it able to restore itself? How does it come back? In a stronger fashion or weaker? So resilience defines the capability of a system to restore itself actually after a shock. Therefore, it's a very wide concept. It can be implemented to the topic of climate change and to topic of migration as well. Because the refugee migration from Syria was a big shock for Turkey, especially for local governments, and they have to deal with this. So, on one hand, we are bound with this general, wider concept of resilience, regardless of the individual topics we focus on, migration, climate change, and global warming. But we are different because we focus mainly on the topic of migration. This is what makes us different from the other organizations working on environment and climate change. UNHCR has 3RP project, Regional Refugee Resilience Plan. We are also different because we focus on local governments and institutions. One common denominator of the other projects on climate change is that they focus on cities at local level. They focus on the resilience of cities. But in our project, we focus on the governments, the local governments, rather than the cities themselves, because local governments, the institutions, are in charge of managing that city when the city faces a shock. So how do we do it? Master plans, migration master plans, is our main instrument. We first start with an analysis stage to understand the relationship between the local government and resilience. Our project RESLOG is related with Syrian refugees, but improving the conditions of life for refugees is not our main purpose, actually. We serve that purpose indirectly, but our main purpose is to accept the influx of Syrian refugees as a shock for local municipalities and to develop the capacity of local governments to serve better to these refugees. So we indirectly serve the improvement of life conditions for Syrian refugees. So we develop an analytical framework for municipal services. As you know, municipalities, legally or based on their definition, are in charge of delivering services for their localities. And there are service providers, local governments, and there are beneficiaries of these services as well. What we'll do in our project is to focus on the service providers rather than the beneficiaries, to have a continuous and coherent flow of services or delivery of services. We have a team of experts, and we started with a teamwork, a desk work, to define all the individual services of municipalities. We examined previous examples from history. We looked into different municipalities which faced influx of refugees before, and we specifically looked at what services were restored after that shock in a very quick period of time. We identified 39 services. That was the basis of our analysis. We visited all different directorates and branches of municipalities to understand to what extent they were affected from the migration flow. We tried to gather evidence-based information. After that, we used this information to understand which service areas or which sets of service areas were affected the most. And we developed plans which would help the municipality to improve those services by using their own resources. The timing of the study was right before the local elections, so we tried to deliver the results before the elections so that the new elected municipality or administration can use the master plan in its election campaign. We have a booklet which is unfortunately only available in Turkish. If you find the RESLOG booth in the exhibition area, you can find our guidance book in which we explain in detail what we do. In conclusion, I'd like to explain in general what resilience means to us. When working with resilience, you first have to understand the fact that although you work with a mathematical framework, we cannot have exact mathematical formulas. For instance, if a municipality is affected related to waste management after the migration flow, you can't become more resilient by increasing the number of waste collectors or vehicles for waste collection. Many other factors must be understood. You have to also take into account the social aspect as well. You have to focus on the essence. Please remember the presentations of yesterday. This was mentioned. The main objective is to keep the streets clean. And there are many things that you can do to keep the streets clean. And you can improve yourself as a local government in many different areas to be more resilient to further shocks. As far as we understood from our experience, and specifically focusing on the refugee crisis after the Syria war, many studies conducted on refugees focused on the beneficiaries, the receiver of services, and these projects were mainly on providing assistance. But focusing on the service provider, the institution, is not only a project or is not only a concept which helps local governments in terms of resilience. This project also helps the local governments when it comes to self-confidence. Because of our administrative structure in Turkey and because the way we manage migration in Turkey, people in Turkey would like to see state as the first intervention mechanism to the migration crisis, actually. But this is not true. Local governments are the primary respondents to the refugee crisis, and they have to do a lot of things to serve these people with limited resources, which is why they're the most important institutions to be made for resilient. So this project aims to help them to use their limited resources in a better way to provide continuous and coherent services to Syrian refugees and at the same time render themselves more resilient. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Sezgin. When we speak of resilience planning and similar concepts, the examples take us to decision makers, actually. I mean, regardless of the team, it all melts down to decision makers. So let's now turn to Mr. Murat Çalık, the mayor of Beylikdüzü, who is a decision maker himself. Would you like to stand on the podium or stay where you are? Okay, the floor is yours, sir.
Evet, danışmanları, plancıları.
So we heard about the advisors and the planners, and now we're going to hear an applier, someone who applies it. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Marmara Municipality's union for organizing cities developing solutions panel. Well, thank you very much for everyone who has been contributing, and I would like to thank the previous speakers. I learned a lot and I took notes of what you said. I am Beylikdüzü mayor. I'm a city planner at the same time. I'm a technical guy too. And I am also involved in decision making in order to improve our city. Before I start talking about the urban resilience, well, I would like to have a look at the living beings. First, what is the tiniest unit of a living being? Cell. Cell adjusts itself according to the environment and safeguards metabolism. It has the ability to repair itself and it can go back to its previous good status. So resilience can be translated into Turkish as flexibility and ability to heal fast. Where do we use the word resilience? We use it in engineering, in psychology, in ecology, and in many disaster issues. We use the term resilience as well. And cities work like a living being too. Cities improve, change, and transform like living beings. And this continuous change and transformation also affects cities just like living beings. So cities get to be resilient. Just like in human life, there are troubles, bottlenecks, tragedies in cities, and there might be floods or there might be earthquakes, acute shocks, or there might be long-term crises like economic crisis or traffic crisis. So there might be an acute shock and chronic stress. So the cities can stand back on its foot again only by being resilient. So in order to have a resilient city, we have to be comprehensive. As local administrators, we have to consider the cities from all perspectives. We have to stand together and we have to discuss different concepts. Istanbul faces earthquake, and we have recently had an earthquake, a small one though, and physically it harms the city, and at the urban side it leads to some problems and some people might get injured, some will die, there might be fire and there will be panic. So this actually leads to economic harm and leads to public trauma, community trauma. So this urban resilience should be adopted by the local administrators as a number one priority. They should focus on it. In Beylikdüzü and in different districts of Istanbul, by the way, as I said before, a city planner, and I was also working in the city planners chamber of Istanbul. So Istanbul is a place we want to live peacefully, but unfortunately we couldn't protect Istanbul, just like we couldn't protect other parts of Turkey. We couldn't protect the natural environment, we couldn't protect the soil, we couldn't protect the shores. This is a reality facing us. The scientific studies conducted tell us about the properties of the resilient cities. They have to be coherent, they have to be flexible, they have to be transformable, they have to be coordinated, transformative, adaptive, and many more adjectives can be mentioned. As you can see, we do not have a very bright table here. We can see the cost of lack of action. We all experience it actually. And how much can we stay without acting? How much can the cities stay without acting? And the authorities, how long can they survive without acting? People who live in the built environments, well, we can't even ensure safety for them. Since there are not enough measures taken, people lost their lives and they still face the danger of losing their lives. Therefore, we can say that our problems are shared. Istanbul's problems can be shared by Beylikdüzü district. So there are joint problems. There are some acute shocks like earthquake or flood. There are also chronic stresses for the cities like unemployment or traffic or insufficient infrastructure, etc. What is important here is cities' capability to cope with those, to be resilient, to be able to do so. So planning here matters more. In the cities should be planned in a more livable way, but unfortunately some wrong political decisions lead the city sail in another direction. We do not think of Beylikdüzü away from Istanbul. Beylikdüzü is almost 400 hectares, 400 hectares big, and Beylikdüzü has a shore length of 12 kilometers. And in Beylikdüzü we have 330,000 citizens, inhabitants, and there are harbors and working areas. So we have additional 150,000 people commuting to Beylikdüzü every day. So we have 500,000 people in Beylikdüzü, we can say. And in Beylikdüzü, we are in search of a new order, a new corporate structure. In Beylikdüzü, why do we care about urban resilience? Beylikdüzü has a certain urban characteristic. What is it? It has an urban growth tendency. It has a disaster risk. It also has some strategic value. We have natural values and natural thresholds like shores, and we work on all of them. What is compulsory for a resilient city? We have to have detailed planning, and we have to be loyal to that planning. The city shouldn't get crushed under the problems, and it should be able to survive, be sustainable, and get away from the shocks. In the new term, Beylikdüzü will be the oxygen for Istanbul, and we wanted Beylikdüzü to be an indispensable part of Istanbul, and because we really care about a planned urbanization where our people can breathe easily. So we know that urban resilience unit is very important, and we established an urban resilience unit. We work on environment, education, community, transportation, and culture. This is our new local approach, and we have a new master plan. What kind of investment will be done where, in which year? We planned all of those actually. I'm not talking about a rough planning. We designed all the details, and we have prepared all the projects in this regard. And we try to base all our projects on resilience. And our approach is going from individual to urban side. Urban resilience starts with the individual, with the citizens. So individuals, the citizens have to be strong in every aspect, and every living being should be able to live in harmony. And all the parts of the urban system should run smoothly in an integrated manner, and they should be able to adapt to the changing situations. So we will have a kindergarten for every neighborhood. This is our target. And we will have library and youth centers for young people, science and art centers. And for the disabled, we will have centers which have high accessibility, and we will have urban parks. In terms of city resilience, community resilience, we work on different pillars like awareness, living together, rights, responsibilities, and belonging culture. We have the body behavior of kids workshop. We have workshops on waste programs, father support program, and building block employees support programs are also worked on. And what about the resilience of the city? Planning, assessing risk, and preparing. These are the titles we work on. We have a disaster knowledge system called ABIS. With ABIS, we guide people to the emergency spots, hospitals in case of an emergency, the fire brigades, water sources. So we integrated all the required information into this system. And thanks to this system, in case of a disaster or in the aftermath, the required response can be provided. And as a result of our work, Beylikdüzü will be a ready, a flexible, an adaptable, and a transformable city. We work our best with our team, and we'll continue doing so. So this is all I have to say, and I would like to thank all of you for being here. I would like to thank the audience as well. Thank you. You very well managed your time, dear Mayor, and you are a planner and you are a decision maker. Well, I said you were a decision maker, but you are a planner at the same time. So thank you for giving us that part of your head too. Resilience and flexibility, we continue discussing it, and we always have to use the word sustainability for planning too. And we have questions arriving. Now we will have the last speaker. Deutsche Städtetag is where he's coming from, and he is closely related to Turkey. Mr. Hilmar Lojewski. So before the meeting, he said he will talk about the concepts and the concept of planning and resilience. Yes, please. Thank you. Distinguished participants, distinguished citizens, distinguished people who look after sustainability, and people who look after resilience. I am one weird person. I was born in abroad. I couldn't learn good Turkish. It has been 35 years since I learned Turkish, so my Turkish is not very good, so I'll continue in English.
In a broader context, and I'm very thankful that Mayor Mehmet Bey has introduced us to a very sound definition, because we panelists tend to think that you're all firm with it. Sinan and I have been confronted with resilience in a different context. When close friends of ours suffer from illness, it's a resilience matter because this term comes from medicine. If we swing back into a stable status, that is resilience. But we have to accept, and I think Mehmet Bey has clearly shown that resilience cannot always be achieved, that we have to, well, not accept fate, kismet, but rather work on optimizing resilience to the utmost possible. Nevertheless, resilience cannot be achieved constantly all the time. Resilience is a matter that will accompany us beyond the lunch break. So I hope you do not lose your inner center by taking 10 minutes plus prior to moving to the buffet. It will be open until 2 o'clock. Let's see that we discuss it in a sound way. I represent the German Association of Cities. That is the equivalent to the Turkish Association of Cities. We are an independent voice of the city. We represent the cities to government. We interlink the cities. We negotiate laws, policies, programs, subsidies. And, well, we also initiate the one or other discussion as the one on resilience, also with our 200 member cities in Germany. We are all some in this one or other context touched by resilience. When my grandaunt was born in 1906, the earthquake of San Francisco happened. When my Turkish grandmother was still alive, she experienced the earthquake in Turkey, and we were really frightened about her well-being. When my one daughter grew up, we experienced the Chinese earthquake. When my very youngest daughter was born, we experienced Fukushima. So we all link it to a personal context, this catastrophe issue, and coping with it through resilience patterns. Is resilience a matter of fate? No, certainly not. It's a part of integrated urban development. And that is my key message. Let us not deal with resilience as an isolated policy item. It needs to be always part of integrated urban development. And again, Mayor Mehmet Bey has shown us how Beylikdüzü, which is also known in Berlin by now, is dealing with this. What are the challenges for cities, at least the challenges for cities in Europe from our perspective? They're summed up by the EU Urban Agenda. You see all the different items. I don't get into detail on this. Challenges for the cities in Germany are all beyond or below natural hazards primarily. Nevertheless, we face natural hazards meanwhile. The strongest storm water we ever had in Germany, 300 millimeters almost in 5 hours. And you see all these impacts of climate change, which thrive for patterns of resilience. Let me briefly try to find some joint understandings and definitions. When we talk about terms, and a lot of terms dominate the conference here as well, we should be clear about what we mean with resilience and integrated urban development, with sustainability and the SDGs, and also with the term sufficiency. The resilience researchers tell us there are 8 very simple steps to become more resilient. I don't get into detail to this as well. You can download the presentation later on. But the things are not as simple. And I like the definition to cope with shocks or stresses without crisis and to recover quickly. But again, we need to be clear about that recovery is not always possible, and we have to be prepared for shocks which are not easy to overcome, personally and also physically in the urban context. Resilience refers, as it says here, to the capacity of an individual, household, population group or system to anticipate, absorb and recover from hazards and or effects of climate change and other shocks and stresses. And I think it became very clear in Beylikdüzü how to cope with this. There is no blueprint for this. We need to find solutions for each and every situation individually. And maybe the approach of integrated urban development helps in this. We can even put it philosophically. Aristotle said, what is composed of its parts so that it forms a uniform whole, which is obviously more than the sum of its parts. That is integration. And resilience as a policy can never stand on its own. It needs to be dealt with interdisciplinary, in an integrated way, and it needs to generate synergies. What are we striving for? We are striving for the good city. And even if we talk about the European city with an ideal density, mixture of uses, short distances, identity, uniqueness, we maybe mean the Oriental city, because this is probably the better European city. This is what we mean with sustainable cities. And to sustain them, yes, we need to adopt some patterns of resilience. What is part of the program of integrated urban development? It is certainly robust and adaptable plans and programs, a careful consideration of permanent investments, because they stand for the next decades to come, and a space to maneuver for future options, action and changes. Also a spatial space to maneuver. That means not using all spaces which we have right now, but leave spaces for the generations to come. We don't need a new definition of sustainability. It's a German definition, by the way, more than 300 years old. Don't extract more than you can add to the system, or don't pack more on the donkey than it can carry. Very simple to explain, because Sinan said it was so difficult to find definitions. Well, this might be one. You all know the triangle, the famous triangle. I believe this triangle is not valid without a basis of identity, values, and democracy. My Chinese friends will forgive me, but I always claim for democracy in the triangle as well. And another thing I'd like you to consider is these 3 angles. We tow at these angles for very different periods of time. We tow at the economic angle for already 250 years. We tow at the social angle for about 100 years, 125 years in Germany. And we only tow at the environmental angle of this triangle for 30 years. So maybe it's time to tow a little bit more intensively at the environmental angle and not always talk about we need to bring this into a balance. Well, it is totally imbalanced. So to bring it back to a balance, we need to tow at one of the three angles more intensively as at the others. Nevertheless, we need the economy and we need the social factors in order to bring it into a balance again. You know about, and we have discussed also at this conference, the global perspectives pretty well. It's time for a paradigm change from anything goes to the high time for change. All preparations for this have been done. The SDGs, COP21, New Urban Agenda, all is there. But we need to integrate it and we need to make use of it, as we do, for example, with the SDGs in German cities. That is the very simple adoption of the SDGs as a very first step in German cities, which is done so far by most of the cities. These are the indicators for the SDGs by the German cities, also available in English. Very simple, 47 indicators to cope with the SDGs. If we put now resilience in urban development, I'd like to make clear why I say don't make an own policy field of it on its own. It needs to be integrated in all the other sectors. It needs to be interlinked with the sectoral programs and plans. It needs to develop synergies. Spatial dimensions is a common denominator, even though we have social issues, as you described with the refugee crisis, be it in Turkey or Germany, and to cope with this through patterns of delivery by the municipalities. We need to carefully consider the permanent investments and again the space for future options and reversions. Resilience can never be looked at as a matter on its own. It is in the context, it is to be seen in the context of integrated urban development. This is also what we have laid down in policy papers for our member cities and made it a part also of the discussion of resilience in urban development. Yes, it is about adaptation, it's about resilient livelihoods, it's about sustainable natural resource management, and also proceeding to the next one. I have another 3 here. Can you proceed manually in front? Because my battery has gone probably.
Slide değiştirebilir miyiz?
Bir basar mısınız? Teşekkür ederim. It's about disaster risk management, health and relationships, and ümit, hope. We also need, well, to face the fact that we face faith, and hence it's not all about technology, it's also sometimes about hoping for the best. Next, please. We have laid down exemplary plans and projects, which I do not go into detail. It's available in English as well, under the title New Planning Culture in German Cities, which touch the fields public space and mobility, new quarters, urban design, urban development, and civil participation, which can be all interlinked to resilience. We have some nice projects to be visited in Hamburg, interlinking landscape with resilience patterns, flood prevention. We have the same in the quarters where, well, the built-up structure gets into an imbalance due to the evading of the barracks and the restructuring of the barracks area into a housing area, as it has been the case in Freiburg. We have other examples where the structure of a city gets into an imbalance, and Mr. Mayor, the mayor of Dortmund is also an urban planner, Mehmet Bey, and I'd very much like you to meet each other, because this imbalance has been overcome also by new housing quarter, which recently won the German Urban Design Prize. So this is bringing back a city from imbalances to a well, at least almost a balance. Beyond this, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, beyond resilience, we have to talk about smart cities and sufficiency as well. Resilience is clear now to us, but the smartness, the term smart cities, tackles us day by day because it's an industry-driven term and we have to cope with that. And we believe in German cities that it's first to mobilize the tacit knowledge, the intrinsic knowledge in the cities by the people, then data and use of synergies, merging projects and hierarchizing projects, prioritizing projects, and maybe then looking after technologies in the third steps. So for us it means more thinking, more adaptable, small scale and reversible planning. The same is valid for sufficiency, and maybe sufficiency, the self-restraint and modestness in urban development, is the new paradigm. It replaces sustainability. We don't know yet how to fit the pieces together, but what we know is we need to consume less, we need to produce and consume better, and we need to produce differently. And this is, so to say, a new triangle of sufficiency. What is the outlook, ladies and gentlemen? The outlook is we probably don't need that much bully resilience. Take Katrina at the eastern coast of the US, investing billions in flood prevention. We need adaptive and smart structures because we cannot cope with catastrophes in all situations of life. This needs to be sufficient, sustainable, and resilient. That is maybe another triangle. We need integrated urban development and a common understanding of cities and their needs. We need rather to cope with the expectation of our people, which is short-term effects, short-term solutions, without losing sight on the long-term effects. We need all stakeholders being part of the planning and implementation process, and we need to face the fact that we need public money for this, which needs to be spent for public interests. That is probably a prime trigger towards resilience. We need the people on board. Without the people, it doesn't match. We need to join hands, and at the end, we need always to be aware, are we standing in front of red or yellow light? Do we feel already on the way towards green? I doubt. It's in the best case yellow. And at the very end, we need to love our cities. Let me have my last slide. The very last, and then I think we can enter into a brief discussion prior to lunch. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much for attention. Çok teşekkür ederim. Yine görüşmek üzere.
Well, thank you very much, Hilmar. This brings us to the end of our panel session. We talked about resilience, strength, resistance. We cannot still find a word in Turkish for this concept, but at least we know how to use it when planning for the future. I see many questions on my screen. It's the first time I'm using such technology. We have questions to each and every panelist. I selected one question for each panelist because we have time restrictions and we don't want to delay for lunch. And I will follow the same order. And we start with Mr. Hinsch. The question is on the screen. As far as I review the indicators of sustainable development and resilience-related indicator-based assessments there is little evidence of land management related evaluations in these mechanisms. So how can ICLEI tackle this with their policies? So the floor is yours.
Understand the question, I must say. If this question is related to which specific indicators of
I understand the question as an urban planner because the indicator on land management is simply the consumption of land.
Oh.
We have a very clear indicator in Germany saying we do not want to consume more than 30 hectares per day. We are at the moment by 60 hectares. So if we reduce it to measuring and coping with indicators, then, well, it's still a way to go, but we come from 120 hectares per day. And hence, there is an indicator also in the international discussion how much land we want to consume for settlement purposes per day. That is a common indicator which is broken down even to the cities, to city councils' decisions. How much land do we want to consume per year in order to come to zero? If you mean that this was land management, we are clear about, and there are indicators also applied by ICLEI member cities.
I think that's the answer.
Peki. Peki, bu...
So the answer provided by Hilmar, is this the answer to your question? Can you please pass the microphone to the lady?
Thank you very much for your contribution. I was definitely meaning that because sustainable city indicators or eco-city indicators or resilient city indicators, there is not much enough reference to really measure how the cities are performing for land management issue because it's the base of the problem. Therefore, I was really wondering if there is any policy in ICLEI or any other global networks. Thank you very much for your answer.
Çok teşekkürler.
I mean, I'm not specifically sort of working on this resilience-based project that I performed. But yes, I think definitely sort of the topic of land management, I mean, is definitely being addressed within the scope of sort of general resilience planning. I mean, from my angle, what is very important is sort of this integrative sort of approach to having this planning in the first place. Yeah. So when you talk about sort of having an indicator based on land management, I mean, yes, to some extent, as we've just heard, I mean, it is being applied. But I think the key question is always how sort of it relates in terms of sort of resilience planning to sort of other indicators or other sort of planning indicators that are being applied and that are out there actually. So yes.
Peki.
Thank you. Be understood that we have indicators for land management as well. The next question is for Ms. Julie Greenwalt. The question is on the screen in English. You prioritize local learnings and solutions. Nonetheless, climate policies are determined at national level. What is your organization's stance towards the coordination and conflicts between those two levels?
tutumu var mıdır bu konuda?
Okay, excellent. So, sorry about that. Okay. So, of course, vertical integration is extremely important for climate policies as well as other things. I mean, the issue of land management that just came up, and a lot of the indicators for land management, for example, are more at a national level, right? So there are sustainable development goals and the Aichi biodiversity targets, but these tend to be tackled by national policy. And sometimes I think there's a bit of a limitation in thinking about how this crosses into urban boundaries, right? And I think that sometimes happens as well with other climate policies. I wouldn't say necessarily that the organization has a stance about this, but certainly we think coordination across different government levels, both horizontally, so with different sectors, different ministries need to be involved, as well as between the national and the local government. And I think there are certainly some successes in this, and we've seen more local adaptation plans and national adaptation plans that work together, but there are certainly plenty of examples of where this is a gap. And there are problems sometimes with different political parties being in power at the local level versus at the national level, and sometimes this can be an issue. There are issues with transfer of funds from the national to the local level. So it certainly is not without its problems, but I think to see effective resilience for urban areas, there needs to be cooperation between the national and the local government, especially because a lot of the resilience issues around water resources, around land management, require a more integrated approach at the regional level. And this is something that isn't always within control of the municipal government. So yeah, I think there are successful examples of this being done in many countries, and it's certainly something that a lot of the international agreements advocate for this cooperation.
Evet. Teşekkür ederim.
Thank you very much. I think Hilmar is going to contribute to this as well.
If you allow me, I'd like to add, yes, there are fierce conflicts between the budgeting of space for the local governments and the settings of regional and state governments in Germany. Why is it so? Because the German cities enjoy total self-governance in this regard. Besides, there are rules and regulations set at the regional level. We have this kind of so-called counter-stream principle, so the cities also have a say in the regional plans. Nevertheless, these conflicts primarily arise from the fact that people at the local level demand two things at a time. They demand less consumption of space, of areas, of open areas, and less density. So we constantly discuss how can we cope with these contradicting demands. The same is valid with the climate policies at the local and at the regional and central level. We would like to have a settlement structure, a settlement pattern, which allows for short distances and public transport. Nevertheless, the reality looks different, and we don't know yet, at least not in Germany, how to cope with that in view of mobility patterns and the patterns of consumption of vacant land. So it is very hard to overcome these contradicting positions, and it's not, from our point of view, it's not the government to cope with that, it's the local governments who have to cope with that.
Peki, çok teşekkürler. Üçüncü soruyu otomatik...
Thank you. The third question goes to Mr. Sezgin. I will read it. What are the municipal problems that occur during planning for migration? Do you develop solutions and support municipalities with your solutions? Well, I know that the answer to this question requires an entire presentation, so please try to keep it short, and please remember that we are all starving. I'm starving as well. There are many problems with municipalities, actually. Municipalities have a lot of problems, so when they say municipal problems, the first thing that comes to mind is institutional or organizational structure. What does that mean? The weak communication or lack of communication between different departments of municipalities. Okay, I'll try to keep it short. When I start speaking, I can get really long, take long. So we work with planning teams at municipalities, not only urban planners, we also work with planners for migration. We try to understand how the municipalities are affected. This requires very strong communication between all levels of the municipality, and this is not easy to obtain, because even in very small municipalities, there are no formal lines of communication or effective communication between different departments. Communication between different departments relies on interpersonal relations between people working at different departments. So this brings us back to the importance of integrated planning, bringing together experts of different fields. Without doing so, you cannot have an integrated way of planning, and as far as I understand from you, municipalities lack such planning skills or communication skills. Okay, Mr. Mayor, your question is, well, I have too many questions for you. I'm trying to select the best one. Now that the previous speaker talked about internal organization, let me ask a question about this department you're planning to establish on resilience. What is the content of this unit? Resilience requires an interdisciplinary approach. So how this unit will work? Will it work with different experts from different fields? What is the main duty of this unit? Is it a planning unit, a monitoring unit, or an implementation unit? Please try to keep your answer short. Well, this requires an explanation which will take us to dinner time, let alone lunchtime. Yes, our approach to resilience is an integrated approach. As I mentioned before, we have 23 districts in our organization, and each unit is in charge of a separate topic, separate subject. When we speak of urban resilience, we cannot bring it down to or reduce it down to planning level only. The services delivered by the Department on Women may have an effect on the resilience of the municipality or resilience of our community. Therefore, all services of the municipality will be coordinated by this unit, and this unit will also provide communication between the units as well. So all the services of the municipality will be filtered through the eyes of the beneficiaries, and of course this unit will help us to reshape the city after a shock. Mr. Hilmar said it very wisely. The city is not for our own use only. We have to make it ready for future generations as well. As a mayor, my duty and my ideal is to solve the problems of the city so that we have a clean sheet for future generations, rather than leaving them with a knot of problems. So this unit is going to tackle with all these problems from the perspective of resilience. This is how I can describe it in a nutshell. Maybe you want to add something to this, Hilmar? No? Okay.
Hilmar Bey'e özel bir soru sorulmuş.
There is a special question for Mr. Hilmar. You showed Farabi during your presentation, Oriental, non-Oriental cities. So how do you consider this within the scope of resilience?
In the Arab world for a couple of years. I have been traveling the Arab world for the last 35 years. I did my diploma thesis in Morocco, I worked in Syria, and I'm close to Turkey. What I want to show my German compatriots is when they claim the European city as the ideal, that we have already an ideal city in history, and that was and is the Oriental city. Short distances, mixture of uses, high density, cohesion of quarters, social permeability. This is all subject of Farabi's ideal city, and this is more to make my German compatriots aware of that they do not own the image of an ideal city, but they have at least to share it with the Arab city or the Oriental city. Why is it resilient? Because it has a structure which can be, not easily, but which can be rebuilt. It's a small scale pattern, and any small scale helps us after catastrophe to reconstruct it. All big scales are difficult to reconstruct and absorb a lot of money and require big investments. So the plot structure of a quarter of a city is already a resilient pattern. In the physical terms. So when what the Almighty might prevent, we will see a heavier earthquake in Istanbul, we will see, or anywhere else, we will see the reconstruction of a small-scale pattern much easier than of a large-scale amalgamated plot pattern. This is my reference to resilience and Farabi.
Çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Efendim, her konuşmacıya birer soru.
Thank you very much. So I picked one question for each speaker, and Mr. Hilmar also contributed to certain questions. There are a few interesting questions too, actually, but let me just read the questions, but no answers, please, because we have to close the session. I'll just read the questions, no answers. So, in the past, the urban resilience was considered from the environmental perspective. The social perspective should be developed more, someone said. So we could take these to think for ourselves. So the climate change and immigration. In terms of climate change, what are the approaches of Western cities, and what about the not that much developed cities? What about their reaction to immigration and climate change? That was asked. So this will lead us to a national policies discussion, actually, not the local side, but political discussion will come out of it. So I just wanted to read the questions, or now I would like to close the session. I would like to thank the speakers for their contribution.